as an emergent property, something that arises when sufficiently complex systems process information in particular ways. Just as wetness emerges from molecular interactions but isn't present in individual water molecules, consciousness might emerge from neural complexity without being reducible to individual neurons. This framework has proven enormously productive. We've mapped which brain regions correlate with conscious perception. The posterior cortical hot zone, including sensory processing areas, appears essential. Damage to these regions eliminates specific conscious experiences while leaving other cognitive functions intact. Meanwhile, the cerebellum contains more neurons than the cerebral cortex, but contributes nothing to conscious experience. Location matters. The thalamus acts as a central relay station, coordinating information flow between cortical regions. Disruption of thalamocortical loops, through anesthesia for instance, reliably eliminates consciousness. We've even developed practical tools based on these findings. The Perturbational Complexity Index measures how the brain responds to magnetic pulses, quantifying something like the amount of consciousness a patient retains after brain injury. These neural correlates of consciousness map where and when conscious experience occurs. They identify necessary conditions, but necessary isn't sufficient. The cerebellum handles complex computations without generating experience. Your immune system processes vast amounts of information without anything it's like to be an antibody. Information processing alone doesn't explain consciousness. This is where competing theories diverge sharply. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, attempts to quantify consciousness mathematically. It defines consciousness as integrated information generated by a system as a whole that exceeds what its parts generate independently. The theory assigns a number, phi, measuring the degree of integration. Higher phi means more consciousness. The appeal is obvious. If consciousness correlates with a mathematical property, we might finally have a measurable, objective criterion. No more philosophical hand-waving, just calculation. The theory makes testable predictions about which systems should be conscious and to what degree, but it also makes deeply counterintuitive predictions. Computer scientist Scott Aaronson demonstrated that, according to IIT's own formulation, a large grid of inactive logic gates arranged properly would be unboundedly more conscious than humans. Tononi accepts this conclusion, arguing it reveals something profound about consciousness rather than undermining the theory. Critics remain unconvinced. The Perturbational Complexity Index, derived from IIT principles, does distinguish conscious from unconscious patients with reasonable accuracy. But whether it's measuring consciousness or merely correlating with it remains unclear. The theory hasn't resolved the hard problem. It's relocated it into mathematics without explaining why integrated information should feel like anything. Global workspace theory takes a different approach. Proposed by Bernard Baars in 1988 and refined by Stanislas Dehaene, it treats consciousness as a broadcasting mechanism. Information becomes conscious when it's shared across multiple brain regions via a global workspace. Unconscious processes operate locally, feeding results into this central arena where they become available to the entire cognitive system. Think of it as a theatre. Attention acts as a spotlight, illuminating particular content on a stage while audiences, various cognitive modules, watch and respond. Only what's lit up is conscious. Everything else processes in darkness, influencing behaviour without awareness. This framework explains many features of conscious experience. why attention is limited, only so much can fit on stage at once, why conscious access creates flexibility, broadcasted information becomes available for multiple uses, why unconscious processes handle routine tasks, they don't need the spotlight. In 2023, the Cogitate Consortium released results from a major study comparing global workspace theory and integrated information theory. Participants viewed visual stimuli while undergoing brain imaging. The theories made different predictions about which neural signatures would correlate with conscious perception. Global workspace theory's predictions largely failed the pre-registered tests. 2 of IIT's 3 predictions passed. This doesn't settle anything. Both theories might be wrong. The test measured neural activity patterns, not consciousness itself, but it demonstrates that competing frameworks make different empirical claims, and those claims can be tested. We're slowly narrowing the space of viable theories, yet none of these approaches touch the fundamental explanatory gap. They describe mechanisms that correlate with consciousness without explaining why those mechanisms generate experience. It's like explaining music by describing speaker vibrations. Accurate, but missing something essential. Some researchers argue we need to look deeper, past neurons to quantum mechanics. Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, proposed orchestrated objective reduction in the 1990s. The theory suggests consciousness arises from quantum processes inside microtubules, structural proteins within neurons. According to OR, microtubules maintain quantum coherence long enough for objective reduction to occur. This isn't the familiar quantum measurement problem, where observation collapses wave functions. Instead, Penrose argues that gravity itself causes spontaneous wave function collapse at sufficient mass-energy differences. These quantum events, orchestrated by microtubules, supposedly generate conscious moments. The hypothesis faces enormous obstacles. Quantum coherence typically requires extreme isolation, near absolute zero temperatures, carefully shielded systems. The brain operates at body temperature in a wet, noisy, thermally chaotic environment. Maintaining quantum effects long enough to matter seems physically implausible. Recent experiments have challenged this skepticism somewhat. Jack Tuzinski's team demonstrated quantum coherence in microtubules lasting several nanoseconds, thousands of times longer than expected. In 2024, researchers stabilized microtubules in rats and found the animals remained conscious longer under anesthesia. The correlation suggests microtubules might play some role in consciousness, though not necessarily quantum. Other physicists have calculated what OR would require. To collapse quantum wave functions in the time frame, Penrose proposes would need roughly 10 to the 23rd power tubulins acting coherently. That's an astronomical number, far beyond what current physics suggests is plausible in biological systems. An experiment conducted under Gran Sasso Mountain in Italy concluded the simplest version of OR is highly implausible. Penrose and Hameroff continue refining the theory, but mainstream neuroscience remains deeply skeptical. The consensus view holds that whatever consciousness is, it operates at the level of neurons and synapses, not quantum mechanics. A different quantum approach bypasses microtubules entirely. Some researchers propose the brain couples with the quantum vacuum, the zero-point field permeating all space. This field isn't empty. Quantum fluctuations generate virtual particles that briefly appear and vanish. Maybe neural activity resonates with these fluctuations, and consciousness emerges from that coupling. This framework reframes consciousness as a field phenomenon rather than a computational one. It suggests awareness involves macroscopic quantum effects without requiring implausible quantum coherence in warm, wet neurons. The brain wouldn't generate consciousness through quantum computation, but through resonant interaction with fundamental fields. The theory remains highly speculative. There's no clear mechanism for how neural activity would couple to the zero-point field, no explanation for why such coupling would generate experience, and no empirical tests distinguishing it from conventional neuroscience. It's an intriguing possibility, not an established framework. More radically, some physicists argue consciousness itself is fundamental. Maria Strömer, a materials scientist at Uppsala University, recently proposed a model where consciousness precedes matter, space, and time. Rather than emerging from physical processes, consciousness is the ground from which physical reality arises. This inverts the usual scientific hierarchy. Typically, we assume matter is fundamental and consciousness is derived. Strömer's framework treats consciousness as a fundamental field, with physics describing patterns within that field. Space, time, and matter become emergent properties of a deeper conscious substrate. Such proposals venture far beyond empirical science into metaphysical speculation. They're philosophically coherent, but scientifically untestable. You can't design an experiment to prove consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. The distinction might be meaningful philosophically, while remaining empirically vacuous. What remains clear is that consciousness poses unique challenges for physical explanation. Every other phenomenon science has explained, from planetary motion to molecular biology, involve describing mechanisms that produce observable effects. Consciousness requires explaining not just mechanisms, but experience itself. Why those mechanisms feel like something. Some philosophers argue this gap is unbridgeable in principle. Physical science deals with objective, third-person descriptions. Consciousness is inherently subjective, first-person. No amount of third-person description could ever capture what it's like to be conscious, because the two perspectives are fundamentally different in kind. Others suggest we simply lack the right concepts yet. Perhaps future physics will introduce entirely new frameworks that make consciousness comprehensible in ways we can't currently imagine. The way quantum mechanics made atomic structure comprehensible after centuries of mystery. Current neuroscience occupies a pragmatic middle ground. It maps correlations between brain states and conscious experiences without claiming to explain why those correlations exist. It identifies which physical processes are necessary for consciousness without specifying why they're sufficient. It measures and predicts without fully understanding. This approach has yielded genuine progress. We can now assess consciousness in patients who can't communicate. We can predict which types of brain damage will eliminate specific experiences. We can even manipulate conscious states with increasing precision through targeted brain stimulation or carefully designed anesthetics. But the explanatory core remains elusive. The hard problem persists, not because we lack data, but because the nature of the problem resists standard scientific methodology. Physical science explains by describing mechanisms. Consciousness seems to require explaining something beyond mechanism, the existence of subjective experience itself. Some researchers propose treating consciousness as a special case of emergence. Just as temperature emerges from molecular motion without being reducible to individual molecules, maybe consciousness emerges from neural complexity without being reducible to individual neurons. Emergence doesn't eliminate the underlying physics, it identifies levels of description that can't be fully captured by lower-level analysis. This framework provides conceptual comfort without resolving the deeper puzzle. Temperature is still fundamentally about molecular kinetic energy. We understand the relationship completely. Consciousness and neural activity don't seem to have that kind of transparent connection. The relationship remains opaque in ways that molecular motion and temperature never were. Perhaps the most honest position acknowledges this opacity without pretending it's been resolved. We know consciousness correlates with specific physical processes. We know disrupting those processes disrupts consciousness. We can measure, predict, and manipulate with increasing sophistication. But we don't understand why any of it feels like anything. The physics of consciousness, such as it currently exists, describes conditions and correlations without penetrating to explanation. We've charted the territory without understanding the terrain, and whether future theories will bridge this gap or reveal it as permanent remains genuinely uncertain. Yet science hasn't abandoned the attempt to build physical theories of consciousness. What changes is the ambition. Instead of trying to explain why consciousness exists at all, researchers focus on identifying what physical conditions make it possible. Not the source, but the substrate. Not the explanation, but the architecture. This shift moves the conversation from philosophy to engineering. If you can specify what physical systems are capable of generating conscious experience, you've constrained the problem dramatically even if you haven't solved it. You've identified which arrangements of matter can support awareness and which cannot. That's progress of a different kind. The most influential attempt at this engineering approach comes from integrated information theory, usually abbreviated as IIT. Proposed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi in 2004, it doesn't ask why consciousness exists. It asks what physical properties a system must have to be conscious. IIT starts with phenomenology rather than biology. It begins by listing the essential features of conscious experience as we know it from the inside. Then it works backward to determine what physical arrangements could produce those features. The central claim is deceptively simple. Consciousness corresponds to integrated information. What does that mean exactly? Take any system, a brain, a computer, a collection of neurons. Information exists when the system's current state depends on its past states in ways that make some configurations more likely than others. A light switch has minimal information. A brain has vastly more because its current state constrains future states in enormously complex ways. But information alone isn't enough. A hard drive contains tremendous information without being conscious. What matters is integration. The information must be unified, irreducible to separate components. A conscious experience isn't just a collection of independent sensations. It's a single, coherent whole, where each element influences every other element. IIT quantifies this with a mathematical measure called phi. Higher phi means more integrated information, which according to the theory means more consciousness. A system with phi equal to 0 experiences nothing. A system with high phi experiences something rich and unified. The theory makes the radical claim that phi is consciousness, not a correlate or indicator, but the thing itself. This leads to some genuinely strange predictions. According to IIT, consciousness isn't limited to biological brains. Any physical system with sufficiently high integrated information would be conscious, regardless of what it's made from or whether it evolved. A properly designed circuit could be conscious, so could certain arrangements of silicon or even mechanical gears if they achieve the right kind of integration. More disturbingly, some unconscious physical systems might have higher phi than we do. Computer scientist Scott Aronson demonstrated that an inactive grid of logic gates, if arranged correctly, could theoretically achieve unbounded phi without doing anything at all. The system would just sit there, but according to IIT, it would be vastly more conscious than any human. Tononi doesn't dispute this. He argues it's a feature, not a bug. The cerebral cortex has exactly this kind of architecture, massive integration with minimal activity in certain states. What seems absurd from an intuitive perspective might actually reveal something profound about how consciousness relates to physical structure rather than function. But this creates immediate problems. If PI is consciousness, then where exactly does consciousness begin? IIT implies sharp thresholds. Below some critical phi value, there's nothing it's like to be that system. Above it, suddenly there is. This seems to contradict the gradual nature of consciousness we observe in development and across species. The theory also struggles with what philosophers call the combination problem. If two separate conscious systems merge into one integrated system, do their experiences combine into a single unified consciousness? If they separate again, do two distinct consciousnesses emerge? IIT's mathematics doesn't clearly specify what happens at these boundaries. Despite these conceptual tensions, IIT has generated genuinely useful tools. Researchers developed the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI, based on IIT's principles. It measures how the brain responds to magnetic stimulation, quantifying the complexity of its response patterns. This provides an objective way to assess consciousness in patients who can't communicate. PCI distinguishes between vegetative states and minimal consciousness with remarkable accuracy. It works across different types of anesthesia and brain injury. For the first time, doctors can measure something close to the amount of consciousness a non-responsive patient retains. That's not theoretical philosophy, that's clinical application saving lives. Yet the success of PCI doesn't necessarily validate IIT's deeper claims about consciousness being identical to integrated information. The index might just be measuring neural complexity that happens to correlate with consciousness without being consciousness. The explanatory gap remains even as the practical tools improve. An alternative framework takes a completely different approach. Global workspace theory, proposed by cognitive scientist Bernard Baars in 1988, treats consciousness not as a special kind of information, but as a particular kind of information flow. It's an architectural theory rather than a mathematical one. The metaphor is theatrical. Imagine consciousness as a stage with a spotlight. Unconscious processing happens in parallel across many specialized modules: visual analysis, language comprehension, motor planning. These processes compete for access to the global workspace, the illuminated stage area. Whatever wins that competition becomes conscious. Whatever remains in the shadows stays unconscious. This explains several puzzling features of consciousness. Why can we only attend to one thing at a time, despite processing vast amounts of information unconsciously? Because the workspace has limited capacity. Why does conscious information seem to be broadcast throughout the brain, while unconscious processing stays localized? Because that's exactly what the global workspace does. It makes information available to all other systems simultaneously. Neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene extended this into the global neuronal workspace theory, specifying the actual brain networks involved. Long-range connections between prefrontal cortex, parietal regions, and sensory areas form the physical implementation of Bars's theoretical workspace. When information ignites this network, triggering sustained activity that reverberates across distant brain regions, it becomes conscious. The theory makes testable predictions about neural dynamics. Conscious perception should produce sustained widespread activation. Unconscious processing should remain brief and localized. Brain imaging largely confirms this pattern. When subjects consciously perceive a stimulus, activity spreads rapidly across the workspace network. When the same stimulus remains subliminal, activity stays confined to sensory regions. But global workspace theory faces its own limitations. It describes the mechanics of consciousness, how information becomes globally available, without explaining why that availability feels like anything. You could imagine a purely mechanical system that broadcasts information to all its subsystems without that process generating subjective experience. The theory maps the plumbing without addressing the water. In 2023, these two leading theories underwent direct experimental comparison. The Cogitate Consortium designed experiments testing specific predictions where IIT and global workspace theory disagreed. Both theories made clear forecasts about what patterns of brain activity would accompany conscious versus unconscious perception. The results surprised many researchers. None of global workspace theory's registered predictions passed the pre-established threshold. Two of IIT's three predictions did. This doesn't mean IIT is correct and global workspace theory is wrong, but it suggests IIT currently makes more accurate predictions about the neural signatures of consciousness, even if its deeper philosophical claims remain contentious. What both theories share is a focus on information and integration. Whether consciousness is integrated information itself or emerges from globally integrated information flow, both frameworks see consciousness as fundamentally about how information is organized and processed rather than what substrate processes it. This computational perspective opens radical possibilities. If consciousness depends only on information architecture, not biological implementation, then artificial systems could become conscious. Not by mimicking human brains in every detail, but by achieving the right kind of information integration or global workspace dynamics. But there's a competing view that might foreclose these possibilities entirely. Some researchers argue that consciousness isn't just about information processing patterns, it's about the specific physics of biological systems, the continuous dynamics, metabolic constraints, and quantum properties that digital computers fundamentally lack. This perspective, sometimes called biological computationalism, suggests that brains don't compute in the way digital computers do. Neural processing is analog, not digital. It's continuous rather than discrete. Most importantly, it's inseparable from the physical substrate implementing it. Computation in biological systems isn't just information shuffling. It's a physical process where the medium matters fundamentally. If this view is correct, then consciousness might require not just the right computational architecture, but the right kind of computing matter. You couldn't create consciousness by running the right program on conventional hardware. You'd need to build new physical systems that instantiate biological-style computation, hybrid, continuous, discrete dynamics, scale-inseparable organization, metabolic grounding. This doesn't mean consciousness is mystical or non-physical. It means the physics matters in ways standard computer science overlooks. The difference between a neuron and a transistor isn't just speed or connectivity. It's the fundamental nature of how they process information, rooted in their physical dynamics. Penrose and Hameroff's quantum consciousness theory takes this biological specificity to an extreme. They propose that consciousness emerges from quantum processes inside microtubules, structural proteins within neurons. Conventional neuroscience treats neurons as classical computers, electrochemical switches that fire or don't fire. Penrose and Hameroff argue the real action happens at a deeper level in quantum superpositions of microtubule states. Their theory, called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR, combines quantum mechanics with a controversial interpretation of gravity. Standard quantum mechanics says superpositions collapse when measured. Penrose proposes they collapse spontaneously when the gravitational energy difference between superposed states exceeds a threshold. This objective reduction doesn't require measurement or observation. It happens automatically based on physical conditions. Hameroff suggested microtubules might maintain quantum coherence long enough for these objective reductions to occur, generating discrete moments of conscious experience. The theory predicts specific quantum effects should persist in warm, wet neural tissue, an environment usually thought to destroy quantum coherence too quickly for it to matter biologically. For decades, this seemed implausible. Quantum effects are fragile. They disappear rapidly in warm, noisy environments like living cells. The brain operates at room temperature with constant molecular chaos. How could delicate quantum superpositions survive long enough to play any functional role? Recent experiments have challenged this assumption. In 2024, researchers found that microtubule stabilizing molecules extended the time rats remained conscious under anesthesia compared to controls. This suggests microtubule dynamics do influence consciousness, though it doesn't prove quantum mechanisms are involved. More striking, physicist Jack Tuszynski demonstrated quantum coherence in microtubules lasting up to 5 nanoseconds, thousands of times longer than expected. This doesn't prove ORC-OR, but it shows quantum effects can persist longer in biological systems than conventional wisdom suggested. Yet serious problems remain. Calculations by other physicists indicate that achieving the quantum coherence ORC-OR requires would need roughly 10 to the 23rd tubulin proteins acting in concert. That's an astronomically large number, requiring coordination across vast distances within a single neuron. The physics seems to make this impossible without invoking completely unknown mechanisms. ORC-OR remains controversial precisely because it requires both speculative quantum gravity and unexplained biological quantum coherence. It's a theory built on two unproven foundations. Even if microtubules do influence consciousness, that doesn't mean they do so through quantum processes. Classical molecular dynamics might explain the same effects more simply. The deeper question is whether quantum mechanics adds genuine explanatory power or just mystique. Consciousness is mysterious. Quantum mechanics is mysterious. Combining them doesn't automatically reduce mystery. It might just create a more baroque puzzle where two unexplained phenomena reference each other without either becoming clearer. What quantum consciousness theories do accomplish is forcing neuroscience to consider whether classical models are sufficient. If consciousness really does depend on quantum effects, then studying neurons as classical computers misses the phenomenon entirely. But if quantum effects are irrelevant, then these theories distract from productive research into classical neural dynamics. Current evidence leans heavily toward classical explanations. Every well-established correlation between consciousness and neural activity can be explained through conventional neuroscience. Anesthesia works through classical molecular interactions. brain damage affects consciousness in ways predicted by classical neural connectivity. No phenomenon clearly requires quantum mechanics to explain. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Quantum effects might play subtle roles we haven't detected yet, or they might turn out to be irrelevant. The question remains genuinely open, not because evidence is balanced, but because we lack decisive tests distinguishing quantum from classical mechanisms in neural function. What all these theories share, IIT, global workspace, biological computationalism, quantum consciousness, is recognition that consciousness poses unique explanatory challenges. They differ dramatically in their proposed solutions, from pure information to biological specificity to quantum mechanics. But they agree that standard reductive neuroscience hasn't captured whatever makes consciousness feel like something. The gap between neural activity and subjective experience persists across all frameworks. You can map information integration with mathematical precision. You can trace global workspace dynamics through brain imaging. You can measure quantum coherence in proteins. None of this explains why any physical process, no matter how complex or unusual, should generate experience rather than operating in darkness. This is where physics runs into philosophy's hard problem and stops. Not because physicists aren't clever enough, but because the tools of physical science, measurement, prediction, mathematical description, seem fundamentally suited to explaining structure and behavior rather than experience. They describe what systems do, not what it's like to be those systems. Some researchers now argue the hard problem reveals limits of physical explanation itself, not limitations we'll overcome with better theories, but permanent boundaries inherent to the scientific method. Physical science proceeds by finding mechanisms that produce observable effects. Consciousness requires explaining not just effects, but the existence of observation itself. This creates a logical circle. Science uses conscious observation to study physical processes. Can those physical processes then explain consciousness without presupposing the very thing they're trying to derive? The explanatory loop seems inescapable if consciousness is both the tool and the target of explanation. Perhaps the strangest feature of consciousness isn't its complexity, but its refusal to behave like other complex phenomena. Most intricate systems in nature yield to explanation once you break them into parts, trace their mechanisms, map their interactions. Yet consciousness persists as something that seems to evaporate the moment you try to explain it through its components. The neurons fire, the signals propagate, the networks synchronize, and somehow inexplicably, this produces the feeling of being something rather than the mere processing of information. What makes this explanatory gap so peculiar is that it doesn't arise from missing data. We can measure neural activity with extraordinary precision. We can correlate specific patterns of brain activity with specific conscious states. We can predict which stimuli will produce which experiences with remarkable accuracy. The problem isn't that we lack information about the physical substrate of consciousness. The problem is that having all this information doesn't seem to address the central question. Why does any physical process, no matter how sophisticated, generate subjective experience at all? This is where neuroscience encounters a conceptual wall that standard scientific methods weren't designed to climb. Consider what happens when you see red. Light at roughly 650 nanometers enters your eye, stimulates cone cells in your retina, triggers cascades of neural signals through the lateral geniculate nucleus, activates specific regions in visual cortex. We can map this entire pathway. We can identify which neurons fire, how strongly, in what temporal patterns. We can even predict with reasonable accuracy whether you'll consciously perceive the colour based on these neural patterns. But none of this explains why this particular pattern of neural activity should feel like anything. Why does it produce the qualitative sensation of redness, rather than operating silently, achieving the same functional outcomes without generating any inner experience? The traditional response from neuroscience is that consciousness simply is these neural patterns, that the question of why they produce experience is somehow misguided, asking for explanation beyond what explanation can provide. Brain states and conscious states are identical according to this view. The gap between them is illusory, created by our limited perspective on the brain's activity. When we fully understand neural dynamics, the mystery will dissolve, except it hasn't dissolved. Decades of increasingly detailed neuroscience have made the gap more precise, not smaller. We now know far more about which neural processes correlated with consciousness. The posterior cortical hot zone, sensory areas in the back of the brain, appears necessary for most conscious content. The frontal regions previously thought essential turn out to be more involved in reporting and reflecting on experience than generating it. Sustained organised activity dependent on feedback loops between cortical regions seemed crucial. Rapid transient activity, no matter how complex, doesn't suffice. These findings refine our understanding of the neural correlates of consciousness, the minimal neural mechanisms necessary and sufficient for any conscious percept. But correlation isn't explanation. Identifying which brain activity accompanies experience doesn't address why any brain activity should be accompanied by experience. The so-called easy problems of consciousness, explaining how the brain integrates information, discriminates stimuli, focuses attention, yield to standard neuroscientific analysis. They're functionally definable. You can specify what they allow an organism to do, then identify mechanisms producing those capacities. The hard problem resists this approach because consciousness isn't defined by what it does, but by what it is like. Explaining the feeling itself requires something beyond functional analysis. Some researchers argue this distinction is artificial. Perhaps we're simply not used to explaining subjective qualities in physical terms. Water molecules aren't individually wet, yet wetness emerges from their collective behaviour. Individual neurons aren't conscious, yet consciousness emerges from their interactions. The analogy seems promising until you examine it closely. Wetness is a relational property defined by how water interacts with other substances. It's perfectly explicable through molecular dynamics without remainder. But consciousness isn't relational in the same way. It exists from a first-person perspective, whether or not anything external observes or interacts with it. The feeling of seeing red isn't constituted by relationships with other things. It's intrinsic to the experiencing subject. This brings us to emergence, which offers another potential resolution. Complex systems exhibit properties their components lack. Temperature is meaningless for individual molecules, but emerges from their collective motion. Market behaviour emerges from individual transactions. Perhaps consciousness emerges from neural complexity in a similar way. Life itself provides a precedent. Biological organisation exhibits properties that don't exist at lower levels of chemical interaction. Consciousness might represent another emergent level, arising once neural systems reach sufficient complexity and organisational sophistication. The formulation becomes life plus special neurobiological features yields phenomenal consciousness, all in physical systems, no dualism required. The difficulty is that emergence typically explains new causal powers or organizational principles, not qualitative experience. Temperature is emergent but still fully explicable through statistical mechanics. Market dynamics emerge from individual actions but remain analyzable through economics. These are cases where higher-level descriptions capture patterns not visible at lower levels, yet nothing about the system resists physical explanation. Consciousness seems to involve something more, the emergence not just of new functions or properties, but of an entirely different kind of fact, subjective experience that exists only from a first-person perspective. Integrated information theory attempts to address this by treating consciousness as a fundamental property of certain physical systems, rather than something that requires special explanation. According to IIT, consciousness is identical to integrated information that exists as an irreducible whole, not decomposable into independent parts. The theory provides mathematical tools for quantifying this integration, producing a value called phi that supposedly measures the amount of consciousness a system possesses. A system with high phi, lots of integrated information, is conscious. A system with low phi isn't. The quality of experience corresponds to the particular pattern of informational relationships the system instantiates. This reframes the hard problem by treating consciousness as an intrinsic property of certain information structures, rather than an inexplicable byproduct of physical complexity. Just as mass is a fundamental property of matter, consciousness becomes a fundamental property of integrated information. The theory makes testable predictions about which systems should be conscious and which shouldn't. It's been used to develop the Perturbational Complexity Index, a measure that assesses consciousness levels in patients by quantifying the brain's capacity for integrated information through brain stimulation and recording. Yet IIT faces severe criticisms. Philosopher Scott Aronson demonstrated that according to the theory's own mathematics, an appropriately arranged but completely inactive grid of logic gates would possess arbitrarily high phi, would be unboundedly more conscious than humans. This seems absurd. Tononi accepts this conclusion, arguing it reflects genuine features of consciousness. The cerebral cortex's architecture resembles such grids, and IIT correctly predicts these structures support consciousness. But accepting that inactive logic gates could be more conscious than humans stretches intuition past breaking. More fundamentally, IIT doesn't explain why integrated information should feel like anything. It asserts identity between consciousness and certain information structures, but doesn't derive one from the other or explain their relationship. Global workspace theory takes a different approach, focusing on functional architecture rather than information integration. Consciousness arises, according to this view, when information becomes globally available across the brain's processing systems. Multiple specialized modules operate unconsciously, competing for access to a limited capacity workspace. Whatever wins this competition gets broadcast to numerous brain regions simultaneously, becoming conscious. The metaphor is theatrical, a spotlight illuminating content on a stage, making it visible to many audiences at once. Unconscious processing happens backstage in specialized modules. Conscious awareness occurs when information reaches the stage and gets broadcast widely. This framework generates testable predictions about brain activity patterns associated with consciousness. Neural avalanches, cascading waves of activity spreading across cortical regions, should characterize conscious processing. Sensory information, competing for access, should show distinct patterns depending on whether it reaches consciousness. Global workspace theory has been extensively tested against integrated information theory through the Cogitate project, which compared predictions about brain activity during conscious and unconscious perception. Initial results showed mixed support for both theories, with neither completely vindicated or refuted. The deeper issue is that global workspace theory, like IIT, explains the function of consciousness rather than its existence. It tells us what consciousness does, makes information globally available for flexible response, and identifies neural mechanisms implementing this function. But it doesn't address why global availability should produce subjective experience. A zombie system processing the same information through the same architecture without any inner experience seems conceivable. The theory captures the functional role consciousness plays in cognitive architecture without explaining why that role requires phenomenal awareness. Perhaps the problem lies in our implicit dualism, the assumption that physical processes and conscious experiences are fundamentally different kinds of things requiring connection through explanation. What if consciousness isn't separate from physical processes but constituted by them in a way we haven't properly conceptualized? This is where biological computationalism enters, the idea that consciousness arises from computation deeply integrated with physical and energetic constraints, rather than from abstract information processing alone. Brains don't compute like digital computers, shuffling discrete symbols according to formal rules. They compute through continuous dynamics, analog processes, metabolic energy flows, physical structure. This suggests consciousness might depend on computational organization that's inseparable from biological implementation. Not because biology is magical, but because the relevant computation can't be abstracted away from physical realization. The difference between classical and quantum computation provides an analogy. Quantum computers don't just run different programs, they exploit physical properties of quantum systems to implement fundamentally different computational processes. Perhaps consciousness similarly depends on computational properties that emerge only from biological organization, involving hybrid, discrete continuous dynamics and metabolic grounding that digital systems lack. This doesn't solve the hard problem, but reframes it. Instead of asking why computation produces consciousness, we ask whether certain kinds of physically instantiated computation necessarily involve consciousness. The question becomes empirical. Does replicating the right computational organization in non-biological substrates produce consciousness? We can't answer this yet because we haven't built systems with the relevant computational properties. But the framework suggests consciousness isn't a mysterious addition to physical processes. It's what certain complex physical computations are like from the inside. Still, this leaves the fundamental explanatory gap intact. Even if consciousness requires specific biological computation, why should any computation, biological or otherwise, generate subjective experience? We can imagine systems implementing identical computations without awareness, processing information through the same mechanisms, but experiencing nothing. The conceivability of such philosophical zombies, systems functionally identical to conscious beings but lacking experience, highlights the explanatory gap. Functional and computational explanations describe what systems do. Consciousness concerns what it's like to be those systems. These seem categorically different. Some researchers now argue the gap reveals permanent limits of physical explanation rather than temporary ignorance. Science proceeds by finding mechanisms that produce observable effects. But consciousness requires explaining observation itself, the existence of a perspective from which effects are experienced. This creates a logical circle. We use conscious observation to study physical processes, then try to explain consciousness through those processes. Can physical science explain the precondition for scientific observation without presupposing what it seeks to derive? This doesn't mean consciousness isn't physical. It might mean the explanatory tools of physics, mechanism, causation, mathematical description, are suited for explaining structure and behaviour rather than experience. They describe what systems do, not what it's like to be them. The gap isn't between consciousness and physical reality, but between third-person scientific description and first-person experiential reality. Physical science captures the former with extraordinary success. It's less clear whether it can capture the latter without fundamentally changing its methods. Current neuroscience hasn't reached a consensus on these issues. The field has identified increasingly precise neural correlates of consciousness, developed sophisticated theories about its functional architecture and information-theoretic properties, traced its emergence through evolutionary and developmental processes. But the relationship between neural activity and subjective experience remains conceptually unclear. The hard problem persists, not because we lack data, but because we lack a framework that makes the data explanatory, rather than merely correlative. What we know for certain is that consciousness depends on specific neural activity in specific brain regions under specific conditions. Damage those regions, disrupt those patterns, and consciousness vanishes or transforms. Anesthesia works through classical molecular mechanisms that disrupt neural dynamics without requiring quantum effects or exotic physics. Every reliable intervention that affects consciousness operates through conventional neuroscience. No phenomenon clearly demands physics beyond standard models to explain. This suggests consciousness, whatever its ultimate nature, is constrained by ordinary physical processes rather than transcending them. Yet constraint isn't explanation. Knowing the conditions necessary for consciousness doesn't reveal why those conditions suffice. The gap between correlation and understanding remains. Perhaps future neuroscience will close it, developing concepts and methods that make subjective experience explicable through neural mechanisms. Perhaps the gap is permanent, reflecting limits of scientific explanation when applied to the very capacity that enables scientific explanation. At present, we genuinely don't know which possibility is correct. The hard problem remains hard not because evidence points toward mystery, but because evidence hasn't yet resolved fundamental conceptual questions about the relationship between physical processes and conscious experience. The difficulty appears when trying to move from physical description to experiential explanation. Neuroscience can map neural activity with extraordinary precision, identifying which regions activate during perception, memory, or decision-making. Physics describes the electromagnetic and quantum processes underlying neural communication. Yet neither discipline explains why any of this activity should feel like anything at all. The shift from mechanism to experience remains conceptually obscure. This isn't a complaint about insufficient data. The issue isn't that we need better brain imaging or more refined measurements of synaptic activity. The conceptual gap exists at a different level. Even with complete knowledge of every neuron's firing pattern, every chemical gradient, every electromagnetic field in the brain, we would still face the same question. Why does this particular configuration of physical processes generate the subjective quality of seeing red, rather than simply processing wavelength information without any accompanying experience? Current neuroscience has achieved remarkable success in identifying neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity patterns associated with particular conscious states. When visual cortex neurons fire in certain ways, conscious visual experience occurs. Damage to specific regions eliminates specific types of awareness. General anesthetics disrupt consciousness by affecting particular neurotransmitter systems and altering neural synchronization patterns. These correlations are robust and reproducible, but correlation isn't causation, and causation isn't explanation. Knowing that consciousness depends on specific neural activity doesn't reveal why that activity produces experience rather than occurring in darkness, processing information without generating any inner perspective. The explanatory framework that works for other scientific questions, identifying mechanisms, tracing causal chains, building mathematical models, encounters something resistant when applied to consciousness itself. One response suggests consciousness emerges from information integration. Integrated information theory, developed primarily by Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information a system generates. The theory starts from phenomenological observations about conscious experience. It's unified yet differentiated, structured yet specific, and derives mathematical requirements for physical systems that could instantiate these properties. According to this framework, consciousness isn't tied to specific biological substrates or computational architectures. Any system meeting the integration requirements would be conscious to a degree measurable by a quantity called phi. This includes counterintuitive predictions. Certain simple arrangements of logic gates, if configured correctly and of sufficient size, would possess integrated information exceeding human levels. The theory's proponent accepts this implication, arguing it reflects how consciousness actually works rather than representing a problem. The practical application has been more straightforward. Researchers developed the perturbational complexity index based on these principles, using transcranial magnetic stimulation and EEG recordings to assess consciousness levels in patients. The measure quantifies how brain activity responds to perturbation, whether disruption produces complex, differentiated responses or simple stereotyped patterns. It's proven clinically useful for evaluating consciousness in unresponsive patients, yet the theory faces persistent criticism. The most fundamental objection isn't about predictions or measurements, but about explanation. Even if integrated information perfectly correlates with consciousness, why should information integration generate subjective experience? The theory provides a mathematical structure that mirrors phenomenological properties, but it doesn't explain why that structure should be accompanied by experience rather than occurring without any inner aspect. It replaces one mystery with another. Instead of asking why neurons generate consciousness, we ask why integrated information does. A different approach emphasizes the brain's functional architecture rather than information metrics. Global workspace theory, introduced by Bernard Baars and later developed into the global neuronal workspace model by Stanislas Dehaene, proposes that consciousness results from information broadcasting across the brain. Unconscious processing occurs in specialized, isolated modules. Information becomes conscious when it wins a competition for access to a global workspace, a network of highly interconnected brain regions that broadcast selected information to multiple systems simultaneously. The metaphor is theatrical. Consciousness is like a spotlight on a stage, illuminating certain contents while leaving others in darkness. Attention controls the spotlight, bringing specific unconscious processes into the global broadcast. What we experience as consciousness is the information currently accessible throughout the brain's cognitive systems. This framework makes testable predictions about neural activity patterns. Conscious perception should involve widespread activation across distant brain regions, particularly in prefrontal and parietal cortex. Unconscious processing should remain localized, failing to trigger this broad activation. The model specifies which neural signatures distinguish conscious from unconscious processing. Recent empirical tests have produced mixed results. The Cogitate project, designed to compare global workspace theory against integrated information theory through pre-registered experiments, found that several key predictions of the workspace model didn't hold as expected. Patterns of widespread activation that should distinguish conscious perception weren't consistently observed. Some predictions of the integrated information approach fared better, though not decisively. This doesn't invalidate the workspace concept, but it suggests the neural correlates of consciousness may be more complex than either theory currently captures. The posterior cortex, sensory and integration areas, appears more critical than the prefrontal regions emphasized by workspace models. Consciousness may depend on sustained recurrent processing in sensory cortex rather than on broadcast to higher cognitive centers. What's notable about these theories is their shared limitation. Both identify neural or informational structures that correlate with consciousness. Both make predictions about which systems should be conscious and how consciousness should relate to brain activity. Neither explains why these structures generate experience. They describe what consciousness does, integrating information, broadcasting signals, without explaining what consciousness is or why physical processes should have an experiential dimension. Some researchers argue this limitation is fundamental rather than temporary. The explanatory gap between physical description and subjective experience may reflect the nature of scientific explanation itself. Science proceeds by identifying mechanisms, showing how systems work through the interaction of components following physical laws. But consciousness concerns the existence of a perspective, the fact that physical processes feel like something from the inside. Explaining mechanisms doesn't explain perspective. You can specify every detail of how visual cortex processes wavelength information, how that information gets integrated with memory and attention, how the integrated representation influences behavior. None of this explains why processing wavelength information should generate the experience of redness, rather than occurring without any accompanying quality. The functional story is complete without the experiential aspect. That's the gap. This leads some philosophers to argue consciousness requires new fundamental physics. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposed that quantum processes in microtubules, protein structures within neurons, generate consciousness through orchestrated objective reduction of quantum states. The theory suggests consciousness involves quantum gravity effects, with superpositions collapsing in ways that produce moments of awareness. The hypothesis faces significant skepticism from both physicists and neuroscientists. Quantum coherence typically requires extreme isolation from thermal noise. The brain is a warm, wet environment where quantum effects should decohere almost instantly. Recent experiments have found some quantum coherence in microtubules lasting nanoseconds, thousands of times longer than initially expected, but still far shorter than the timescales consciousness operates on. More fundamentally, calculations suggest the gravitational effects required for the proposed quantum collapse mechanism are minuscule at neural scales. To collapse quantum states in biologically relevant timeframes would require coordinated behavior across astronomically large numbers of tubulins, around 10 to the power of 23 proteins acting in concert. No known mechanism could maintain such coordination. Even if quantum effects operate in the brain, it's unclear why they would explain consciousness rather than just adding complexity to neural processing. Quantum mechanics describes how particles behave, not why particle behavior should generate subjective experience. Replacing classical neurons with quantum neurons doesn't address the hard problem. It just relocates the mystery to quantum systems. A more recent proposal suggests consciousness involves resonance with the quantum vacuum, the zero-point field permeating space. According to this model, cortical microcolumns form coherence domains through interactions between glutamate neurotransmitters and the electromagnetic zero-point field. These domains stabilize quantum effects and maintain the critical neural dynamics characteristic of conscious states. Disrupting this resonance produces unconsciousness. The theory attempts to bridge quantum physics with neuroscience by proposing that consciousness requires coupling to fundamental quantum fields rather than being purely a product of neural activity. It's speculative, and the evidence supporting it remains preliminary. The proposal illustrates a trend in consciousness research. When conventional neuroscience reaches explanatory limits, some researchers invoke more exotic physics, but exotic physics doesn't automatically solve explanatory problems. Even if consciousness involves quantum field interactions or zero-point energy coupling, we still face the question of why those physical processes generate experience. The gap between physical mechanism and subjective awareness persists regardless of whether the mechanism is classical or quantum, local or field-based, neural or vacuum-coupled. Perhaps the most radical response abandons the assumption that consciousness emerges from physical processes at all. Instead, consciousness is proposed as fundamental, a basic feature of reality like space, time, or mass. Physical processes don't generate consciousness, they constrain or organize it. The universe isn't fundamentally made of matter and energy that somehow produces awareness. Awareness is intrinsic to the physical world, with complex systems like brains organizing pre-existing consciousness into specific experiential forms. This panpsychist or idealist position inverts the standard scientific framework. Rather than explaining consciousness through physics, it suggests physics itself emerges from consciousness. Space, time, and matter arise from a fundamental consciousness that precedes and underlies physical reality. Quantum mechanics, with its observer-dependent properties and measurement-induced state changes, supposedly hints at this deeper truth. These proposals move beyond mainstream science into speculative metaphysics. They're not testable in conventional ways and don't generate empirical predictions distinguishable from standard neuroscience. They represent philosophical interpretations rather than scientific theories. Whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, whether quantum or classical, doesn't change how anesthesia works or which brain regions correlates with which experiences. The practical neuroscience continues regardless of metaphysical debates. Researchers map neural correlates, develop consciousness measures for clinical use, study how brain damage affects awareness, investigate anesthetic mechanisms. This work produces real knowledge, understanding which brain systems are necessary for consciousness, how different types of awareness depend on different neural processes, how consciousness can be temporarily eliminated or restored. What this work hasn't produced is explanation in the deepest sense. We know consciousness depends on specific neural activity under specific conditions. We can increasingly predict and manipulate conscious states through physical interventions. What we cannot explain is why those physical states are accompanied by subjective experience rather than occurring in the absence of any inner perspective. Some researchers maintain this gap will close through continued neuroscientific investigation. As we understand neural processing more completely, the mystery will dissolve. Others argue the gap is permanent, that science can describe consciousness's neural basis, but never explain why neural activity generates experience. The explanatory tools of physics and neuroscience are suited for describing structure and function, not for explaining the existence of subjective perspective. This doesn't mean consciousness is supernatural or non-physical. It might mean our concepts of explanation need revision when applied to consciousness. Scientific explanation typically proceeds from third-person observation of objective processes. Consciousness is first-person and subjective by nature. Perhaps explaining consciousness requires methods that can bridge these perspectives rather than reducing one to the other. Current neuroscience hasn't achieved this. We have increasingly precise neural correlates, sophisticated functional theories, detailed models of information integration, and global broadcasting. We can predict when consciousness will occur and measure its presence or absence. What remains unclear is the relationship between all this physical description and the fact of subjective experience itself. The hard problem persists, not because we lack data, but because we lack a conceptual framework that makes the data explanatory rather than merely correlative. The most honest assessment is that we don't yet know whether this gap can be closed through continued scientific investigation or whether it reflects permanent limits of physical explanation when applied to consciousness. The evidence doesn't clearly point in either direction. We know consciousness depends on physical processes. We don't know why those processes suffice to generate experience, or what kind of explanation could bridge the gap between neural description and subjective awareness. Perhaps the most revealing thing about consciousness research isn't what it's discovered, but what it's systematically avoided. For decades, the field has operated through a careful division of labour. Neuroscientists map correlations between brain states and reported experiences. Philosophers debate whether these correlations explain anything fundamental. Physicists occasionally propose quantum mechanisms, but rarely commit to testable predictions. Everyone agrees consciousness exists. No one agrees what that existence means or how to study it without presupposing answers. This division reflects genuine uncertainty about what kind of problem consciousness presents. Is it a biological question about neural mechanisms? A physical question about information and causality? A philosophical question about the relationship between subjective experience and objective description? The answer determines which methods apply and what would count as explanation. But we can't determine the answer without already having methods and explanations. The field circles this problem repeatedly, making progress on specific questions while the fundamental question remains unchanged. Consider what neuroscience has achieved. Decades of imaging studies, lesion analyses, and pharmacological investigations have identified specific brain regions and processes correlated with conscious experience. Damage to the posterior cortex eliminates visual awareness while leaving reflexive responses intact. Anesthetics that bind to particular receptor types reliably eliminate consciousness. Specific oscillation frequencies in thalamocortical networks correlate with conscious versus unconscious processing. These findings are robust and reproducible. What they don't provide is explanation in the sense philosophers demand. Knowing that posterior cortical activity correlates with visual awareness doesn't explain why that activity generates subjective visual experience, rather than occurring without any accompanying awareness. The correlation is tight and necessary. Damage those regions and visual experience disappears. But necessity isn't explanation. The question persists: why should any physical process be accompanied by subjective experience? This is where competing theories diverge. Global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Baars and expanded by Stanislas Dehaene, proposes that consciousness arises when information becomes globally accessible across the brain's processing networks. Information processed locally in specialized modules remains unconscious. When that information gets broadcast to a network of regions including prefrontal cortex and parietal areas, it becomes conscious. The theory offers testable predictions about which types of information should be conscious based on whether they achieve global broadcast. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, takes a different approach. It starts from phenomenology, the properties of conscious experience itself, and derives requirements for physical systems that could generate those properties. Consciousness, according to IIT, is identical to integrated information. A system is conscious to the extent it generates information that cannot be reduced to its parts. The theory provides a mathematical measure, phi, that quantifies this integration, and in principle determines both the quantity and quality of any system's consciousness. These theories make different predictions that can be tested. In 2023, a large-scale project called Cogitate published results comparing predictions from global workspace theory and integrated information theory. Participants viewed images while brain activity was measured through multiple methods. The theories predicted different patterns of activity that should correlate with conscious versus unconscious perception. The results were mixed and surprising. Predictions from global workspace theory largely failed. Expected signatures of global broadcast didn't consistently distinguish conscious from unconscious processing. Predictions from integrated information theory performed better, but not decisively. The experiment revealed how difficult it is to test theories of consciousness cleanly. Different measurement methods gave different results. The boundary between conscious and unconscious processing proved fuzzier than either theory suggested. What's striking is how little this uncertainty affects practical neuroscience. Clinicians can assess consciousness in non-communicative patients using tools like the Perturbational Complexity Index, derived from integrated information theory principles. The tool works whether or not the theory's metaphysical claims are true. Anesthesiologists continue refining their understanding of how different drugs affect consciousness through empirical investigation independent of any grand theory. Researchers map neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision, regardless of philosophical debates about explanation. This suggests the field has reached a plateau where empirical progress continues without theoretical convergence. we accumulate detailed knowledge about which brain processes correlate with consciousness under which conditions. We develop better tools for measuring and manipulating conscious states. What we don't develop is consensus about what this knowledge explains or what kind of explanation would satisfy the fundamental question. Some researchers argue this is acceptable, that explanation should be understood as correlation plus prediction rather than requiring some deeper account. If we can predict when consciousness will occur and manipulate it reliably, perhaps that's all explanation amounts to. The demand for something more reflects philosophical confusion rather than scientific inadequacy. Others maintain the gap is real and significant. Knowing the neural correlates of red experience doesn't explain why those correlates generate redness rather than another quality or no experience at all. The explanatory gap isn't about missing empirical details, but about the kind of explanation physical science provides. Physical explanation describes structure, function, and causal relationships between objective processes. Consciousness is subjective by nature. Perhaps explaining subjectivity through objective description is fundamentally inadequate. This is where quantum theories enter, though not as solutions so much as alternative frameworks. Orchestrated objective reduction, proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, suggests consciousness involves quantum processes in microtubules within neurons. The theory remains controversial and faces significant challenges. Experiments testing whether microtubules can maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures show mixed results. Some measurements detect quantum effects lasting longer than expected. Others suggest the conditions required for the theory to work are physically implausible given what we know about cellular environments. More recent proposals suggest the brain might couple to the quantum vacuum, the zero-point electromagnetic field pervading space. According to this framework, consciousness arises not from neural computation alone, but from the brain's resonant interaction with fundamental quantum fields. This would explain why consciousness seems to involve integration and binding of information in ways that exceed classical computation. These quantum theories face a common problem. They propose mechanisms without clearly explaining why those mechanisms generate subjective experience rather than simply performing computations. Even if brains do implement quantum processes, the question remains why quantum processes should be accompanied by awareness, while classical processes are not. The quantum framework changes the proposed mechanism, but doesn't necessarily change the explanatory situation. Some researchers have moved to more radical positions, suggesting consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative. According to these views, consciousness isn't produced by physical processes, but precedes them. Physical reality emerges from or depends on consciousness, rather than the reverse. This inverts the standard scientific picture entirely. These proposals typically invoke quantum mechanics measurement problem as evidence. Since observation seems to play a role in determining quantum outcomes, perhaps consciousness is fundamentally involved in physical reality structure. The universe might be participatory in John Wheeler's sense, consciousness and physical reality co-creating each other through ongoing interaction. Such interpretations move beyond testable science into philosophical speculation. They're not empirically distinguishable from standard neuroscience in most contexts. The practical work of understanding neural correlates and developing consciousness measures continues regardless of whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, quantum or classical. The metaphysical status doesn't change what we measure or how we intervene clinically, what remains clear is the asymmetry between our empirical knowledge and our theoretical understanding. We know with increasing precision which brain states correlate with which conscious experiences. We can predict and manipulate consciousness through physical interventions. We've developed sophisticated theories describing how information integration or global broadcasting might relate to awareness. What we haven't achieved is consensus about whether this knowledge constitutes explanation or merely correlation. The field's honest position is uncertainty about whether this gap can be closed through continued investigation or reflects permanent limits of physical explanation when applied to subjective experience. We don't know whether consciousness will eventually be explained through neuroscience, requires new physics, or demands a conceptual revolution that changes what explanation means. This uncertainty isn't failure, it's where the science currently stands. The question of how physical processes generate subjective experience remains open not because we lack data, but because we lack agreement about what kind of answer would satisfy the question. Different researchers hold incompatible views about whether the explanatory gap is real, whether it matters, and what closing it would require. Meanwhile, empirical work continues. Neural correlates are mapped with increasing resolution. Theories generate testable predictions about information processing and consciousness. Clinical tools improve for assessing awareness in non-responsive patients. This work produces genuine knowledge even without resolving the fundamental mystery. Perhaps the most important development is recognizing consciousness research as inherently interdisciplinary, requiring perspectives from neuroscience, physics, philosophy, and mathematics. No single field's methods suffice because the problem spans empirical investigation, theoretical modelling, and conceptual analysis. Progress requires distinguishing carefully between what we've measured, what we've theorized, and what we've assumed. The current state is more sophisticated than popular accounts suggest. We're not completely ignorant about consciousness. We've discovered remarkable things about its neural basis and functional properties. We're not on the verge of complete understanding. Fundamental questions about subjective experience remain unresolved. We're somewhere between, accumulating detailed empirical knowledge while debating what that knowledge explains and whether current explanatory frameworks can bridge the gap between physical description and subjective awareness. What's certain is that consciousness depends on specific physical processes in specific configurations. Damage those processes and consciousness disappears. Restore them and it returns. This dependence is tight, reliable, and increasingly well understood. What's uncertain is the nature of that dependence, whether consciousness is produced by, identical to, or merely correlated with those physical processes. This uncertainty doesn't make consciousness mysterious in a mystical sense. It makes it difficult in a scientific sense, a phenomenon we can measure and manipulate without fully understanding the relationship between our measurements and the thing being measured. The hard problem persists not because consciousness is supernatural, but because our explanatory tools were developed for third-person objective phenomena, and consciousness is first-person and subjective by nature. The field hasn't solved this problem. It's clarified it, mapped its boundaries, and identified where different approaches succeed and fail. That's significant progress even without resolution. Understanding what we don't understand is genuine knowledge, especially when it prevents premature claims of explanation or dismissive skepticism about the question's legitimacy. What comes next likely involves continued empirical investigation of neural correlates, refinement of theories about information integration and global broadcasting, testing of quantum hypotheses where possible, and philosophical work on what would constitute the explanation of subjective experience. These efforts proceed in parallel without necessarily converging toward consensus. The honest assessment is that consciousness research has achieved much while the fundamental question remains open. We know more about the neural basis of awareness than ever before. We've developed sophisticated theories and clinical tools. We've clarified where explanation reaches its current limits. What we haven't determined is whether those limits are temporary obstacles or permanent features of trying to explain subjectivity through objective description. The relationship between explanatory success and explanatory satisfaction reveals something peculiar about consciousness research. We've developed increasingly sophisticated accounts of information processing, neural dynamics, and computational architecture. These accounts work remarkably well for predicting behavior, designing interventions, and building artificial systems. Yet they systematically avoid the feature that makes consciousness interesting in the first place: the fact that there's something it's like to be the system doing the processing. This isn't ignorance about mechanisms. We understand quite a lot about how visual information gets processed, how attention selects certain signals for deeper analysis, how memory consolidates during sleep. The problem emerges when we ask what all this processing feels like from the inside. A complete functional account, one that predicts every behavioral output from every input, wouldn't necessarily explain why those functions are accompanied by subjective experience rather than occurring in darkness. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between structure and what that structure instantiates. A bridge's structure determines whether it supports weight, but consciousness seems to involve something beyond structure, a qualitative character that isn't captured by describing information flow or causal relationships. Science excels at explaining structure. Whether it can explain this other thing remains contested. The neural correlates of consciousness represent genuine progress. We know that specific regions, particularly in posterior cortical areas, are reliably associated with conscious perception. Damage these regions and certain experiences disappear. Stimulate them and experiences arise. This correlation is tight, reproducible, and increasingly detailed. We can track which neural patterns accompany seeing red versus green, hearing middle C versus middle D, feeling pain versus pressure. But correlation, however precise, doesn't necessarily constitute explanation. We observe that whenever certain neural patterns occur, certain experiences occur. We can predict one from the other. We can manipulate the neural pattern and observe corresponding changes in reported experience. None of this tells us why these particular patterns are accompanied by these particular experiences, why this configuration of electrical activity feels like seeing blue, while that slightly different configuration feels like seeing yellow. The explanatory gap isn't about missing data, it's about the relationship between physical description and phenomenal quality. Physical descriptions specify quantities, relationships, and causal connections. Phenomenal experiences have qualities, redness, pain, flavour, that seem categorically different from any physical property. Describing how neurons fire doesn't obviously translate into describing how things seem. Some researchers argue this gap reflects conceptual confusion rather than genuine mystery. They suggest that once we fully understand information processing, the question, why does it feel like anything, will dissolve as misconceived. Others maintain the gap is real and unbridgeable. That subjective experience involves something fundamentally different from physical process, requiring either new scientific principles or acceptance that some phenomena resist third-person explanation. Neither position has won decisively. The debate continues because both sides can point to genuine difficulties in the other's position. Eliminativists struggle to explain why the question seems so pressing if it's merely confused. Dualists struggle to explain how something non-physical interacts with the physical brain. Various middle positions, property dualism, neutral monism, panpsychism, each carry their own conceptual costs. Integrated information theory attempts to bridge this gap by proposing that consciousness is identical to integrated information above a certain threshold. The theory defines consciousness mathematically through the phi metric, which quantifies how much information a system generates beyond what its parts generate independently. High phi corresponds to high consciousness. 0 phi means no consciousness. This approach has virtues. It makes specific predictions about which systems should be conscious and to what degree. It explains why certain brain regions matter more than others. They contribute more to integrated information. It provides a framework for assessing consciousness in patients who can't report their experiences. The Perturbational Complexity Index, derived from IIT principles, shows promise in clinical settings for distinguishing conscious from unconscious states. The theory also faces serious objections. Critics point out it predicts that simple systems, arranged correctly, would be highly conscious despite lacking anything resembling a brain. Theorist Scott Aronson demonstrated that a grid of inactive logic gates, properly configured, would have astronomical phi values, more conscious than any human according to IIT's own metrics. The theory's creator acknowledges this but argues it's a feature rather than bug, claiming similar architecture exists in cortical structures. This disagreement reveals something important about consciousness theories generally. They often succeed at explaining certain features, information integration, global broadcasting, neural synchronization, while making predictions that seem counterintuitive when extended to edge cases. The question is whether the counterintuitive predictions reveal genuine implications we must accept or indicate flaws in the theory's foundations. Global workspace theory offers a different approach. Rather than defining consciousness through integration, it focuses on broadcasting. According to this framework, information becomes conscious when it's broadcast from local processors to a global workspace accessible throughout the cortex. Unconscious processing occurs in specialized modules. Conscious experience arises when that processing gets broadcast widely, enabling multiple systems to access and act on the information. This theory has substantial empirical support. We observe that conscious perception involves widespread cortical activation, while unconscious processing remains localized. Brain regions identified with the global workspace, prefrontal cortex, parietal areas, anterior cingulate, show consistent activation during conscious experience across different sensory modalities. The theory explains why consciousness seems unified, despite arising from distributed processing, and why only certain information reaches awareness, while most processing remains unconscious. However, global workspace theory faces its own version of the hard problem. It explains which information reaches consciousness and how that information gets distributed. It doesn't explain why globally broadcast information is accompanied by subjective experience while locally processed information isn't. Broadcasting is a functional property, information getting shared widely. Consciousness involves something beyond function, what it's like to have that information. Some researchers argue this objection misunderstands what explanation means in science. Physics doesn't explain why mass generates gravitational attraction. It describes the relationship mathematically and shows how that relationship produces observable effects. Similarly, consciousness theories needn't explain why broadcasting or integration feels like something. They need to specify the conditions under which experience occurs and predict its properties. If they succeed at that, they've explained consciousness in the only sense science can explain anything. This response has force but doesn't fully satisfy. Gravity's effects are publicly observable, objects falling, orbits curving. Consciousness involves private, subjective states. Explaining the conditions for consciousness doesn't obviously explain consciousness itself unless subjective states are identical to those conditions. But whether they're identical or merely correlated is precisely what's disputed. The Cogitate project attempted to test competing theories directly. Researchers designed experiments to distinguish predictions from integrated information theory and global workspace theory. Initial results from 2023 showed mixed outcomes. Some predictions from each theory were confirmed, while others weren't. Neither theory clearly won. This suggests the theories might capture different aspects of consciousness, or that our experimental methods can't yet distinguish adequately between them. Quantum approaches add further complexity. Orchestrated objective reduction proposes that consciousness involves quantum processes in microtubules within neurons. According to this hypothesis, quantum coherence in tubulin proteins undergoes objective reduction, a gravity-induced collapse of the wave function, generating moments of conscious experience. The theory attempts to explain both consciousness and its timing, proposing that the collapse occurs at specific intervals determined by quantum gravity thresholds. Recent experiments provide some support. Researchers found that stabilizing microtubules extended the duration. Rats remained conscious under anesthesia. Separate studies showed quantum coherence in microtubules lasting longer than expected, nanoseconds rather than femtoseconds. These findings suggest quantum effects might persist in warm biological environments longer than previously thought. But significant challenges remain. Calculations indicate that generating sufficient gravitational effects for objective reduction would require implausibly large numbers of tubulins acting coherently, around 10 to the 23rd proteins. The warm, wet brain environment should destroy quantum coherence almost instantly through decoherence. Most neuroscientists remain skeptical that quantum mechanics plays a significant role in neural function, though few dismiss the possibility entirely. Alternative quantum proposals suggest consciousness involves resonance with the quantum electromagnetic zero-point field rather than isolated quantum processes within neurons. According to this framework, cortical structures interact with fundamental quantum fields pervading space, creating coherence domains that stabilize quantum effects despite thermal noise. Disruption of this coupling might explain loss of consciousness under anesthesia or during sleep. These ideas remain highly speculative. They require experimental confirmation and face the same fundamental question as classical theories. Even if consciousness involves quantum processes, why do those processes feel like something? Quantum mechanics is still physics. It describes mathematical relationships between observables. The hard problem applies to quantum descriptions just as it applies to classical ones. The possibility that consciousness is fundamental rather than Emergence represents a different approach entirely. Some physicists propose treating consciousness as a basic feature of reality, comparable to space or time, rather than something that arises from complex organization. In this view, physical processes don't generate consciousness. They specify how already existing consciousness manifests in particular forms. This perspective inverts standard assumptions. Instead of asking how brain activity produces experience, it asks how fundamental consciousness becomes structured into the specific experiences we have. The brain wouldn't create consciousness, but rather constrain and focus it, determining which aspects of a universal conscious field become actualized in a given organism. Such proposals face obvious difficulties. They struggle to explain why consciousness seems so tightly coupled to specific neural processes if it's fundamental. They don't obviously predict anything that competing theories don't predict. They risk being unfalsifiable. If consciousness is fundamental, any observation can be accommodated by adjusting how the fundamental field manifests. Without specific testable predictions, these frameworks remain philosophical positions rather than scientific theories. The emergence account offers a more conventional explanation. Complex systems develop properties that their components lack individually. Water molecules aren't wet, but water is wet. Individual neurons aren't conscious, but brain networks are conscious. The question is whether consciousness is weakly emergent, meaning it's in principle reducible to underlying processes, or strongly emergent, meaning it involves genuinely novel properties that can't be predicted from complete knowledge of components. Most neuroscientists implicitly assume weak emergence. Given sufficient understanding of neural dynamics, we should be able to explain consciousness the same way we explain wetness, by showing how it arises from component interactions according to known physical laws. Critics argue consciousness requires strong emergence because no amount of third-person physical description seems to capture first-person subjective experience. The debate hinges on whether this appearance reflects genuine metaphysical difference or merely epistemological limitation. Practical progress continues regardless. Clinical tools for assessing consciousness in non-responsive patients have improved substantially. The Perturbational Complexity Index measures how the brain responds to transcranial magnetic stimulation, quantifying its capacity for complex integrated responses. Higher PCI correlates with greater likelihood of conscious awareness. This allows doctors to distinguish minimally conscious states from vegetative states more reliably than behavioral assessment alone. Similar techniques help predict recovery from coma. Patients showing higher complexity in brain responses are more likely to regain consciousness. Those showing minimal complexity rarely recover. These tools don't resolve philosophical questions about consciousness's nature, but they demonstrate genuine progress in understanding its neural basis and predicting its presence or absence. Research on altered states provides additional insight. Studies of psychedelic experiences, meditation, anesthesia, and sleep reveal how consciousness varies with changing neural dynamics. Default mode network activity decreases during certain mystical experiences. Thalamic gating changes during different sleep stages. Specific anesthetics target specific receptors, disrupting consciousness through distinct mechanisms. These findings map the conditions under which consciousness emerges, persists, or disappears, even without explaining why those conditions matter. Artificial intelligence raises parallel questions. Current AI systems process information, solve problems, and generate behaviour without anything resembling consciousness, as far as we can determine. They lack the integrated, globally accessible workspace that characterises conscious brains, according to Workspace theory. They don't exhibit the kind of integrated information that IIT associates with consciousness. But as AI systems become more sophisticated, incorporating features resembling biological cognition, the question of their potential consciousness becomes pressing. Some researchers argue that sufficiently advanced AI with the right architecture could be conscious. Others maintain that consciousness requires biological implementation or quantum processes impossible in silicon. Still others suggest the question is ill-formed because consciousness isn't the kind of property that admits of clear presence or absence. It might come in degrees or types that don't map cleanly onto human categories. The honest position is that we don't know. We have detailed knowledge of neural correlates, sophisticated theories of information processing, and practical tools for assessing consciousness. We lack consensus on what all this knowledge explains and whether current theoretical frameworks can bridge the explanatory gap between physical description and subjective experience. This situation is uncomfortable, but not unprecedented. Physics went through similar uncertainty about the nature of light, heat, and time before reaching current understanding. Consciousness may require similar conceptual revolution. Alternatively, it may remain permanently resistant to third-person explanation, representing a genuine limit on scientific knowledge. What we can say with confidence is that consciousness depends on specific physical processes arranged in specific ways. Disrupt those processes and consciousness vanishes. Restore them and it returns. The dependence is reliable, tight, and increasingly well mapped. What remains unclear is the nature of that dependence, whether consciousness is produced by, identical to, or merely correlated with physical processes, and whether answering that question requires new physics, new philosophy, or recognition that certain explanatory demands exceed what any theory can provide. The field hasn't solved the hard problem. It's mapped the territory where explanation currently stops. We know which neural processes correlate with conscious experience. We can predict when consciousness will occur and measure its presence or absence. We've developed theories describing information integration, global broadcasting, and neural dynamics. What we haven't determined is whether these descriptions constitute explanation or merely sophisticated correlation. This distinction matters. Correlation tells us what accompanies consciousness: specific brain states, particular information structures, certain types of neural activity. Explanation would tell us why those physical conditions generate subjective experience rather than occurring without any inner dimension. The gap between these two kinds of knowledge defines the current state of consciousness research. Some researchers maintain this gap will close through continued neuroscientific investigation. As we understand information processing more completely, as we map neural dynamics with greater precision, the question of why physical processes feel like anything will dissolve. They argue it's a pseudo-problem arising from confused concepts rather than genuine mystery. Once we fully understand the mechanisms, the demand for something beyond mechanism will seem misguided. Others argue the gap is permanent. Physical science describes structure, function, and causal relationships between objective processes. Consciousness is subjective by nature. No amount of third-person description can capture first-person experience because they're fundamentally different kinds of knowledge. Explaining consciousness through physical mechanisms may be like trying to derive colour from equations describing wavelengths. The mathematics is accurate, but leaves out the qualitative dimension entirely. Neither position has won decisively. The debate continues because both can point to genuine difficulties in the other's framework. Those claiming the gap will close struggle to explain why it seems so persistent if it's merely conceptual confusion. Those claiming its permanent struggle to specify what kind of explanation could possibly satisfy them if physical description doesn't suffice. What's clear is that consciousness depends on physical processes in specific configurations. Damage certain brain regions and consciousness disappears or transforms predictably. Restore those processes and consciousness returns. This dependence is tight, reliable, and increasingly well understood. What remains unclear is the nature of that dependence, whether consciousness is produced by physical processes identical to them, or merely correlated with them in ways we don't yet understand. The practical work continues regardless of these conceptual debates. Neural correlates are mapped with increasing resolution. Clinical tools improve for assessing consciousness in non-responsive patients. Theories generate testable predictions about which systems should be conscious and under what conditions. This research produces genuine knowledge even without resolving fundamental questions about what consciousness is or why it exists. The most significant development may be recognizing that consciousness research requires perspectives from neuroscience, physics, philosophy, and mathematics simultaneously. No single discipline's methods suffice because the problem spans empirical measurement, theoretical modeling, and conceptual analysis. Progress requires distinguishing carefully between what we've measured, what we've theorized, and what we've assumed. The current state is more nuanced than popular accounts suggest. We're not completely ignorant. We've discovered remarkable things about consciousness's neural basis and functional properties. We're not on the verge of complete understanding. Fundamental questions remain unresolved and may remain so indefinitely. We occupy a middle ground, accumulating detailed empirical knowledge while debating what that knowledge explains and whether current frameworks can bridge the gap between physical description and subjective experience. What we can state with confidence is limited but substantial. Consciousness requires specific types of neural activity in specific brain regions. It correlates with certain patterns of information integration and global broadcasting. It emerges from complex biological systems rather than simple ones. It can be measured, predicted, and manipulated through physical interventions. These facts constrain theories without determining which theory is correct. What we cannot state with confidence is whether these correlations constitute explanation, whether consciousness is fundamentally physical, requiring only better neuroscience to understand completely, whether it involves quantum processes that classical neuroscience misses, whether it's an emergent property that can't be reduced to components, or a fundamental feature of reality that physics must eventually incorporate. These questions remain open not because evidence is insufficient, but because researchers disagree about what would count as sufficient evidence. This situation creates discomfort. Scientific fields typically progress toward consensus. Consciousness research has progressed empirically, while theoretical disagreement persists and possibly deepens. Different frameworks explain different aspects successfully, while none explains everything. This suggests either that consciousness is more complex than individual theories capture, or that our explanatory standards need revision. The honest position acknowledges both what we've achieved and what remains uncertain. We know more about neural correlates of consciousness than ever before. We've developed sophisticated theories and practical tools. We've clarified where standard scientific explanation reaches its limits. What we haven't determined is whether those limits are temporary obstacles or permanent features of explaining subjectivity through objective description. Perhaps most importantly, we've learned that consciousness research forces questions about the nature of scientific explanation itself. What counts as understanding? When is correlation sufficient? Can third-person methods fully capture first-person phenomena? These aren't just questions about consciousness, but about the scope and limits of physical science. The field hasn't answered these questions. It's made them precise enough to investigate systematically. That's genuine progress even without resolution. Understanding what we don't understand and why we don't understand it represents knowledge of a particular kind. Knowledge about the boundaries of current explanatory frameworks and the challenges any future framework must address. Where consciousness research goes from here likely involves multiple parallel tracks. Continued neuroscientific investigation mapping correlates with increasing precision. Refinement of theories about information integration and global broadcasting. Testing of quantum hypotheses where testable predictions exist. Philosophical work clarifying what would constitute explanation of subjective experience. These efforts proceed without necessarily converging toward unified understanding. The central question remains open. Physical processes give rise to or correlate with conscious experience under specific conditions. We can identify those conditions with increasing accuracy. What we cannot explain is why those conditions suffice, why any physical process, however complex or unusual, should be accompanied by subjective awareness, rather than occurring without any inner dimension. That explanatory gap defines the hard problem. It persists not because we lack data, but because we lack conceptual frameworks that make the relationship between physical process and subjective experience intelligible, rather than merely correlatable.